Testing, y'all still hear me well?
Hi, everybody. Thanks to those
Cool.
who are logging in. And we're going to just take a couple of minutes to let everybody join the webinar before we get started. Looks like lots of folks are signing in. So thank you, everybody who's joining the webinar. And we'll just give it a couple more minutes as people sign in. Still see more people signing in. So we'll just give it another minute or two as folks join the webinar, just to make sure everybody can be present at the beginning. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Carl Silverstein, Executive Director of Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy, and so happy that you're with us today for this webinar, Lunch and Learn, on the geology of SHC's South Yellow Mountain Preserve. We're thrilled that you were able to join us. I want to introduce Marquette Crockett, who's SHC's Roan Stewardship Director, and Park Greer, who is the Preserve Manager for the South Yellow Mountain Preserve, and Cheryl Fowler, who's SHC's Membership Director. We're grateful to you all for being part of the webinar, and this will be available as a recording afterwards. So please share it with your friends, because I know it's going to be an interesting time learning about the geology of the preserve. So with that, I'm going to invite Park to go ahead and let it begin. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Cheryl, am I coming through loud and clear?
You sound great.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for attending this Lunch and Learn that is hosted by the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. My name is Park Greer, as Carl previously mentioned, and I'm the manager of the South Yellow Mountain Preserve, which is a 7,500-acre nature preserve, research preserve, up in Mitchell and Avery counties of North Carolina. One of the interesting things that I've had a chance to do in my last 2.5 years of exploring the preserve is really getting to know the rocks and the formations and all the different kinds of minerals that can be found on the preserve, as well as the history of extracting those rocks and minerals. So I'm really happy that you all joined me today, and I'm excited to present the geology of the South Yellow Mountain Preserve. Now, first, I want to go just a brief overview. I'm going to keep this really simple. I'm not going into any graduate level or even probably some undergraduate level geology. Most of this you've probably learned in elementary, middle, or high school. So hopefully this is a good refresher for that. I'm just going to start with rocks and then go into forces and then the how that all culminates on the preserve. I'm going to pause a little bit at the end of each section. So if anyone has any questions during that section, Cheryl will be fielding that for me. So to begin, our rock types. Now, you might remember there's three main rock types: the igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary. We're going to start with the intrusive igneous, which is a subcategory of igneous rocks, and those are rocks that are formed and cooled deep within the earth, sometimes also called plutonic rocks, after the Greek god of the underworld, Pluto. Some of the examples, especially a notable local example, is this photo here of Looking Glass Rock down in, can't remember which county it is, maybe Transylvania or Henderson, but it is a granite pluton that was formed underground, and then it was cut. It was still buried, but as that top layer eroded away, it left behind this harder, more resistant rock to weathering. Other examples of intrusive igneous rocks can be diorite or gabbro. A lot of the times you'll notice this crystallization in a lot of these igneous rocks, as well as pegmatite, which we'll talk about a little bit later because that's got more of an impact on the preserve. Now, the next type of igneous rock is extrusive igneous rock. And in this photo, it's a perfect example. I believe this is out in Hawaii, of a new rock being created. It is coming out as magma, although it's lava when it reaches the surface. And as it cools in the ocean, it creates a new rock, or cools on the land, it creates also a different kind of rock. Some of the examples of extrusive igneous would be pumice, which is so airy that it actually floats in water. You have obsidian, which has been incredibly important all across human history, and even into modern times, where obsidian scalpels are far sharper than steel scalpels in the medical industry. Basalt, which if you ever get a chance to go to Idaho or Nevada or overseas, then you can see these fantastic, just very strange examples of where lava has flowed and then cooled. And when it cooled, it created these hexagonal columns. You can see them at Devil's Postpile in California, and then the Devil's Tower also up in Wyoming. Or all along outside of Boise, there's a big long wall of basalt, and that just tells you at one time that was a giant layer of lava that was just flowing over the surface and then slowly cooled. And then there's also tuff, which is sometimes classified as a sedimentary rock, but it has its origins deep in the earth, and it is blown out of volcanoes, typically ash and debris. And tuff is one of those rocks that is, despite its name, tuff, it's not tough at all. It's really, really soft. And it is so soft that you can dig into it, such as the peoples of Derinkuyu over in Turkey did over 1,000 years ago. And they were able to build an underground city that some estimates say housed about 20,000 people. The next rock is sedimentary. If you're from the middle part of Tennessee or middle part of Kentucky or anywhere near those plateaus out there, you're very familiar with sedimentary rock. These are rocks that are formed by the deposition of other rocks or minerals or living material. It becomes a rock when it is buried and undergoes compaction and cementation. And it often forms layers, as you can see in the sandstone here, as well in a little bit in this arch that can be found at the Big South Fork National Recreation Area on the Tennessee-Virginia border. It also pockets and weathers really well. For instance, you can see the layers of the sandstone from the deposition, but then you can see the after weathering in the form of those little holes that look like they've been dug out of the rock. And that's wind and water erosion making that happen. You also have slate, which forms these really, really thin layers. And I am sorry, I meant to say shale, not slate. But it's the same thing. It forms these really thin layers and breaks off very nicely along those cleavage planes. And then there's limestone, which is personally my favorite rock, partly because I grew up on a limestone bluff, but also partly because it has caves. Now in North Carolina, there's not a lot of limestone. There's a good bit of it over near the Linville Gorge, and some of y'all can get a chance to experience that through the Linville Caverns. I would recommend, I'm not being paid for this, I'm not sponsored, but I would recommend going and just checking it out. The next type is the metamorphic. And these are igneous or sedimentary rocks that underwent immense heat and pressure deep within the earth. And for instance, this is the Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park over in Colorado. And the white streaks are actually an intrusion of an igneous rock, and the darker rocks are a metamorphic rock. So the darker rocks are older than the white streaks that you see in this photo. And we'll talk about intrusion a little later. There's also marble. This is from a natural marble cliff found over in Russia. And marble is a metamorphic rock of limestone. There's quartzite, which many of y'all probably have some countertops made of quartzite. It's a beautiful rock when it's been cut and polished. And this is sandstone that has undergone those compression and heat cycles. Now I'm going to pause here for a minute before we move on. Are there any questions about types of rocks?
If you don't have any questions now, there'll be plenty of opportunity toward the end of the lunch and learn.
Great. All right, I'm going to move on real quickly then. So those are the types of rocks. We have most of them on the preserve, but we mainly have metamorphic and igneous. So now that you have that, we're going to move on, just very, very briefly go over some forces. First off, we're familiar with, most of us are familiar with the tectonic plates and how they're always moving kind of on this mantle of magma and a couple other interesting forces. But when you have all these different plates coming together, you have three different boundaries. There's the divergent boundaries, which are when plates move away from each other. And you can see that on this photo to the left. And they create long, narrow valleys called rift valleys. Now, in the ocean, when an ocean plate and an ocean plate move apart, magma comes up to the surface and creates these mid-ocean ridges, and that's also where new ocean floor is made. Another example of a continent on continent rift valley would be in Africa, the Great Rift Valley. Now, the convergent boundary occurs when plates move towards each other, and this middle photo kind of shows that depending density of the different layers, one layer slides on top of the other while the other does. So the middle photo there, and when that happens, you end up getting hotspots or volcanoes, or you've heard of the Ring of Fire. A lot of the time, that's what's happening. Those are convergent boundaries along the edge of the Pacific plate. And the last one is transform plates. This is where plates move apart from or across from one another. This is where the crust is not destroyed, like in convergent boundary where it goes down, melts, and forms a new rock. This is where they just get deformed. And these often cause shallow earthquakes. Now, one of the results of these different plate boundaries is you get things like folds. And folds occurs where rocks are under immense compressive stress. And these are some examples of folds that I found on the preserve. I think both the same type of rock, which will amphibolites in a minute, but you can see how much pressure it must have taken to just cause those rocks to fold. And you can see some other fantastic examples of folding driving up and down I-26, particularly going into Tennessee and looking at the road cuts. Roadside geology is a real thing. And the next one would be faults. A fault is a fracture zone between two blocks of rock. And sometimes they move rapidly, which causes earthquakes, and sometimes they move very, very slowly. And then they can range in length from anywhere from a few inches to thousands of miles. And this photo I'm showing you here is a fault that divides the Appalachian and the Allegheny Plateau, located up in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, along Route 15. And right in the middle of the photo, you can see where there are two different, where the fault goes right up the middle there. Now, I'm not really going to touch on the formation of the Appalachian Mountains. I was trying to find a way to make it a condensed single or double slide, and I just could not. It is so incredibly complicated that I think that deserves its own lunch and learn. So I can answer a few basic questions, but I'm not really going to touch on the Appalachian Mountains until another lunch and learn. So stay tuned, and please attend that one as well. But now we're going to talk about the South Yellow Mountain Preserve. This is a new map put together by the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And the older map, the last one was done, I think, in 1962. So this map this shows the entirety of the spruce pine quadrant. The upper right of the map is where the preserve is, and I'll zoom in on that in a minute. But in order to make this new map, which was published this year, 2024, the geologists from the NCDEQ, they came out and they climbed all over the preserve just to update this geologic map of this one quadrant of North Carolina. They crawled into tunnels, they crawled in creeks, they pulled out hand lenses, they took compasses and readings. It was really cool to hang out with them. But I also believe that they are the first winner of the South Yellow Mountain Preserve Best Album Cover. All right, before I move on to rock types, any questions? Or rock groups?
Doesn't look like we have any yet, Park.
Woohoo! All right, we're moving right along. So this is an example of the old map on the left, 1962, and the new map on the right, 2024. This is zoomed in specifically on the areas around the preserve. You can see it's still somewhat similar. A couple of the lines have adjusted and some new layers have been added. But geologic maps are really, really interesting because it allows you, especially if you're a rock hound, it allows you to look at the different areas where different rocks are or where they have been found or identified. And say you're looking for a particular mineral and it occurs in this rock, you can use these maps to go to those areas and instead of just panning for gold in a creek that doesn't have any gold. Also, I just love all the pretty colors. So our first rock is going to be amphibolites. Amphibolites is the most common occurrence on the preserve. I'm going to go back one slide. it is all it's what you see all in the green color here. So it is the most common rock on the preserve. It is typically dark green to black, fine to coarse grained. What that means is if you were to look at it really closely or with a microscope, you can tell the different grains on it, and where sandstone would be a fine grain and granite would be more of like a coarser grain. And it is named so because it contains amphiboles, which is a group of prism or needle-like crystals. So this sample on the left is a fantastic example of just amphibole, and then on the right is zoomed in, and you can see those crystal structures. It shimmers in the light almost like mica does. These rocks are from Precambrian age, typically the Neoproterozoic era, which we're talking from like 1 billion years old to about 400 something million years ago. And when eroded, it releases sodium, magnesium, calcium, and iron, which really makes plants happy. And most of the areas that I have found in fibrillite, especially when the conditions are right, the canopy is open and the soil is wet, we find our special plants that we're trying to protect. This is one of the Gray's lily growing in an amphibolite area. Another interesting thing with amphibolite is it raises the pH to more neutral, so less acidic, which is good not just for Gray's lily, but it also helps to keep rhododendron down. And from looking at the geologic map and then from my examples of walking the preserve, most of the thickets, or the thickest of the thickets, do not exist on the amphibolite layers. There's a few here and there, but as a rule, that higher pH is not as friendly to rhododendrons. Our next one is going to be pegmatite. Now this is igneous. Oh, amphibolite is a metamorphic. Pegmatite is an igneous rock, and it intrudes into other layers. So on this photo on the left, you see my coworker Kyle looking at a pegmatite intrusion. So this is where this salacious water or liquid material made its way into the fractures and the faults of the rock. And I believe the rock on either side of this is possibly an amphibolite. And then it just cools and creates this beautiful rock made of feldspar, quartz, and mica. The photos on the right, feldspar is the one on the top, quartz is the shinier one on the bottom, and then, of course, we all know mica, especially if you walk around in it and then track it into your house, and now your house is full of glitter. But it's of Devonian age, so we're talking 420 to 360 million years ago. And when you find the bodies of pegmatite, it can be anywhere from a couple inches to tens of meters, such as this one here in the picture. There's another example of a pegmatite boulder. This is what most of the mines were mining, and we'll talk about that a little later. It also produces some of the most impressive boulders that I've seen on the preserve. On the left here, my coworkers Riney and Lee are sitting at the base of what I first thought was a cliff, but then after walking around it, turns out it was just a boulder that detached from the main pegmatite body. And then this is a mine in the middle digging down into the pegmatite, and then another beautiful pegmatite boulder on the right. Now, granodiorite, mineralogically, it is similar to pegmatite, meaning that it contains feldspar, quartz, and mica. It is typically light gray, and it is non to weakly foliated, and it is coarse grained. So it is an intrusive igneous just like pegmatite is. So when you find granodiorite, which in this photo is where you see the pink and it says DSPG, that's where the granodiorite is. It's primarily located on the southern half of the preserve. And then for those attending the hike on Saturday, we'll get a chance to see the granodiorite because it is located also around the Falls of Guges Creek. It has a much higher thickness of body. So instead of the decimeters to tens of meters, it can go anywhere from decimeters to kilometers thick. And then one of the fun things about the granodiorite is that if anyone's been to Rome and been to the Pantheon, the portico columns, which are these columns in the front, are single shafts of granodiorite. Not from spruce pine, unfortunately, but it is the same rock. The next one is going to be the ash metamorphic suite. Now this is on this map, you can see it is all these kind of white streaks going through there. And it is undivided layer, which means that it is still being investigated. It is typically, as more field work is done, these units will be broken up and subdivided into the appropriate layers. And it is typically composed of schists and metawax and meta sandstones. These are not from the preserve, by the way. Although if anyone that lives in Black Mountain, there's a great geologic exhibit behind the Swannanoa Valley Museum there. And that's that photo on the right. And
Hey,
they
Park,
also,
we have a
yes.
question if it's a good time to answer it.
Yeah, we could pause right here.
What prompted the new geological survey of the area?
That is an excellent question, and I have a feeling it's on a rotating basis. Every so often, it's like we have to go through and update X, Y, and Z, because they're moving on to another unit later on. These are, oh, and I think that's a good thing to differentiate. These are geologists with the NCDEQ. These were not geologists that are working for a private company. So they're doing it more for the good of the science as opposed to any form of ulterior motive. But touching briefly back on the ash metamorphic suite, they also form these really jagged cliffs that you can see here. And even walking along this with my friend Nate there were 3 or 4 different rock types that I was able to identify just in there. One of them was a metawack, which I think used to be called graywacke. And then there was a couple of fibrilites and some quartz down in there. So this is one of those rock layers that just as we do more science and as we gather more data, we'll be able to understand how to classify these layers. Because as you might have seen from that geologic map, the rocks are not granite, sandstone. They're all mixed in. Not quite homogeneous, but definitely intermingling. The next rock layer that we typically have on the South Yellow Mountain Preserve is the pegmatite and metasomatic schist. And that is all this blue that you see down there, or ZAPM is its identifier. And it is found at the southern part of the preserve. And it is a heterogeneous mix of pegmatite, granodiorite, schist, and others of the ash metamorphic suite. And what that means is kind of like the previous one, all of those rocks are just mixed in together, not homogeneously. There'll be a little bit here, there'll be a little bit there, there'll be a little bit here, but it's not in these big smooth layers that you get with some of the other rock layers. And I believe for those who came on the Beaver Creek Walk hike, they were able to see some of this pegmatite and metasomatic schist layer. On the left, you can see where a creek has been eroding those layers, but you can still see the deposition layers or the layers between the rocks there. And then on the right, you see a cliff with a bunch of the participants scattered about the boulders. And a better view of that cliff shows what this layer typically looks like, where the infibrilite is typically large boulders or bedrock, and the pegmatite, same thing, bedrock or boulders. The schist and the metagraywacke, which I believe this rock is that metagraywacke, it's very foliated, meaning it has all those little layers into it. That's a good looking group of people. Now, some accessory minerals. There are hundreds of minerals that can occur in these rock types. Some are really common, some are really rare. I've just chosen 3 today that are some of the what I found the more interesting. We could go on, once again, an entire other lunch and learn just on the minerals found within the Southern Appalachians. But these are garnets, and garnets are a silicate mineral, and they're one of the largest group of minerals, the silicates. And they normally exist as dodecahedral crystals, as you can see embedded in both rocks on the side and as well as the picture in the middle. And they come in many colors, but red is the most common. The name to get the name garnet, it's followed this kind of long chain from Latin to Old French to Middle Dutch, but originating in Latin granatum, translating to pomegranate, of which the garnet shares a very similar color, as well as the crystals are typically about the size of pomegranate seeds. It is normally about the same size as the seed. Sometimes you'll get big garnets, but that's a little more rare. It is often used in gemstones, but when it's not for gemstones, it can be used as abrasive in a sandpaper, or they'll put sometimes even the whole crystals in a water jet for water jet cutting of steel beams or other really hard materials. And if anyone's interested, it's the birthstone of January. Now, pyrite, this is one rock that I have not found on the preserve, so I don't know what it looks like in that habitat. We've all seen the cubes of pyrite or sometimes the shapes of pyrite seen on the rocks in the photos here. It is listed as being an accessory mineral that has been identified by geologists, but I've not seen it yet, so I don't have any specific photos of it on the preserve for you. But it is often called fool's gold. As we can see, it does kind of have a resemblance to gold. But it is an iron sulfide mineral, whereas garnets were a silicate mineral. These are iron sulfide minerals, and it is the most abundant in the sulfide category. It also has a language tree from Greek to Latin and then Old English, originally Greek, and I'm sorry if I do not get this correctly, but purities, meaning of fire or from fire, because it can produce sparks when it's struck with steel. The next is kyanite, and this one might be familiar to anyone who does any alpine, or not alpine climbing, but high elevation climbing here in the Black Mountains or the Balsam Mountains, or now I guess the Preserve. It is an aluminosilicate mineral, and it is normally found in metamorphic rocks, and it indicates formation deep within the earth. And it comes directly from Greek, meaning kuanos or dark blue. It shares the same root word as cyan or cyan. And it is commonly used in ceramics, dishware, porcelain, or as a refractory agent, which is an agent that is highly resistant to heat stress. So they use it in insulating bricks and also in kiln equipment. And when you typically find kyanite, this is its form. Very rarely do you find crystals like in the previous photos. But if you're up on, say, I think it's just below the peak of Silo Peak, there's a beautiful kyanite outcrop near the top of the cliff. I'm going to pause there. Any questions, Cheryl?
No, none yet.
We're going to move on to human history real quick, and I'm going to touch on pre-colonial, 1800s to 1950s, and then 1950s to present. I don't know much. I'm still investigating a lot of the pre-colonial history. It is absolutely fascinating, but also requires a lot of digging through some really old documents. But a lot of the uses of the mica of the region was for carvings, as you can see here from the Hopewell tradition. And these are held in a museum, but some of the mica that the Hopewell tradition used were traced back to the Southern Appalachian Mountains, and a few of them even in Mitchell and Avery counties. Some of the mica they used was for ornamentation or decoration, not necessarily tools that I know of, but also they would use quartz from the area for things like projectile points. There was also a story of what's called the Sinkhole Mine, which is the mica mine in Mitchell County, and it's a few miles from the preserve, so it's not on the preserve. But when it was first visited by settlers, there were signs of extensive workings already being done on it. And some historians think that it has been mined for quite a few centuries. Commercial production didn't begin there until 1867, so unfortunately it'd be a little harder to do an archaeological investigation since it had been a commercially viable mine since the 1860s. Now, from the 1800s to the 1950s, it was typically mica and feldspar were the name of the game. Scrap mica and sheet mica were used in all sorts of things, and many of the mines were small and worked by only a handful of men, and others, like the Chestnut Flats mine and the Cloudland mines, were extensive operations. The Chestnut Flats mine, in the 1920s, it was actually chosen as the site to source the quartz for the reflecting lens, or for the lens on the Mount Palomar Observatory, which at that time was the largest optical telescope in the world. And it came right there from Spruce Pine. And this mine is a few hundred yards from the preserve, so we share that same quartz ore body in the pegmatite. And then the next big mine was the Cloudland mine. On the photo on the left, there's a cabin in the foreground, and you can see a scar going up the side of the mountain behind it. That is the entire mine. It has thousands of feet of underground workings, and you can see one photo here looking from the inside out, and then the other photo looking from the outside in. And it was started maybe as the Tom Green mine in the 1860s, but it eventually changed its name to the Cloudland mine because it the tailings pile where they weren't using the quartz, they were just after the mica and the feldspar. The tailings pile was so bright and so big that you could see it from the Cloudland Hotel up on the top of Roan Mountain, which is about 4 or 5 miles as the crow flies, or as the raven flies. And in 1896, the site produced over $100,000 worth of mica, which in today's money is $2.4 million. And that was just in 1 year. And then they shut down in the 1950s. This mine is on the preserve. Some of the things that people used the mica for pre-1950 was in things like stove glass or spark plug insulation, electrical insulation, and ground mica used for abrasive agents. And the name mica actually comes from the Latin for mica, which is crumb. And it might have been influenced by micere, which means to glitter. And it has been used in everything from those pictured here to cosmetics and paint. Also, it was used in bigger sheets as an anti-glare cover on early fighter planes, World War II. And feldspar is typically mostly used in glass, ceramics, enamel, glaze, and porcelain. This Parian hollowware here on the left, the reason it became so white is because it was mixed. That particular part of it was mixed and brazed with a bit of feldspar. And then this is that's actually on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's from about the mid 1800s. And then in the middle here is feldspar porcelain. The main ingredient in this porcelain is feldspar, and these are currently up for auction, not by me. And then on the right, this goes back to this photo is particularly from the 17 to 1800s, and this is what's called feldstatic stoneware, and it's one of the only types of stoneware that has a little bit of translucence that is not porcelain. So it's been used in all sorts of ceramics and porcelain for a long time. Now, the types of mines that this feldspar and mica were being pulled out of from the 1800s to the 1950s kind of come in three different categories. On the left, you have the adits. These are the mines that went into the mountain. In the middle, you have the cuts. These are mines that were, as it looks like, cut into the mountain. And then you have just the surface mines, which often manifested as pits or sometimes just big bowls in the ground. And they are now on the preserve. In many of these mines, in order for me, that helps me to identify whether it's a mine or a natural formation, is the presence of these boreholes. This is where they would have used the typically a pneumatic drill or a hydraulic drill and dug or bore into the ground, packed it with dynamite, blew it out, and that's how and then come through later with bucket scoops and pull it out. So this is a telltale sign. If you're ever curious about, is it a mine or is it a cliff? If it's got these boreholes, that's a good sign. So far, I've found about 45 mines on the preserve, and all of them fit into one of those three categories mentioned earlier. As you can see on the bottom of the map, there's a big collection of them, and that is those mines that are in that pegmatite mesosomatic schist layer, as well as in a little bit of the pegmatite layers. And the mines on the upper left are mostly feldspar mines, and they're in that ash metamorphic suite or the amphibolite areas. And a lot of the mines today, they're still in operation. Not any of the ones on the preserve, obviously, but where these 4 stars are 4 of the big mines of Mitchell and Avery counties. Going counterclockwise from the top, there's the Vulcan pit, and that's typically deals in aggregates. So for things like concrete use or construction material. The one going down to the bottom, that is a shared quartz corp and Sibelco mine, and that is primarily mining some of the purest quartz on the planet that is used in making crucibles that they will melt silicon into to pull out big single cell or single crystal silicon that they make semiconductors and transistors out of. So your electronics are able to function as well as they can because of this one mine here in Spruce Pine. And then going a little bit more to the right, there's another quartz corp mine that is actively mining. And then furthest on the right is another Sibelco mine, their schoolhouse plant that also mines the quartz. Well, that has been a brief 35-minute overview of the geology of the South Yellow Mountain Preserve. I know I breezed over a lot of complicated topics, so now we have some time for questions. And I just thank you so much for everyone tuning in, and this allowed me to share one of my passions.
We do have two questions, Park. One of them is, are there any petroglyphs on the South Yellow Mountain Preserve?
Not that I have found. And I've not found any petroglyphs. I've not found any pictographs either. Most of what I have found in the past on the other areas have been more pictographs than petroglyphs. But who knows? This is a big area. It was shared by two tribes as typically a hunting, trading, transit ground. So there could be. We'll just have to keep our eyes open whenever we're out.
And the second question is, would you be able to share the link for the NCDEQ new map?
Absolutely. Is there a way we can send this out to everyone in an email?
I believe so.
Okay, I will get that to everyone. It's a really cool map to play around with.
And that's let's see, we have one more. Yes, can I get the map? So I think we have more than one person is interested in seeing the map. One more question. Do you see fossils of plants or animals in these rocks?
I do not. And the main reason that I don't see fossils is these rocks are older than plants or animals. They're older than trees. You typically find fossils in sedimentary rocks, and there's not a lot of sedimentary rocks on the preserve. Actually, I'm not aware of any. It's pure sedimentary rocks. So no, I've not found any. I don't expect to find any.
One more. I think Park is correct about the NCDQ survey being scheduled across the state. There was another on Silo Mountain. So just a comment.
I'll have to get that topo or that geologic map too. That sounds cool.
I believe the questions have slowed down. That might be it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone once again so much for coming. And I hope that you enjoyed this hopefully informative presentation on the geology of the South Yellow Mountain Preserve.
Thank you, everybody. We do appreciate your being interested in our webinars and lunch and learns and everything that we're doing there at the preserve and beyond in the Southern Appalachians. It's your support really that enables this great work to happen. So we're grateful. If there's no other questions, we'll look forward to seeing you hopefully in the future on another webinar or on the preserve on one of our outings. So stay tuned.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.